What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. Today is a very exciting day because we are finally gonna be getting to work on this Evo 10 that's been sitting in my garage for a while. If you guys have watched the channel for a while, you know we picked this car up in New Jersey about, I don't know, it's quite a few months ago now. It was blown up and pretty much abandoned for like 2 years, just sitting on jack stands, and he was gonna part the car out, but I said, hey, let me just take the whole car. So we did that, we brought it back to the house. It's been sitting in my garage ever since. But in the meantime, I've had the block and head machined, and we have pretty much everything: crank, pistons, rods, head studs, everything we need to get this engine back complete and ready to run essentially. So looking at our table of parts, you can see we have the block itself. This is all machined out to 86.5. We have manly rods, manly pistons, some ARP head studs, ACL bearings, ACL thrust washers. We have the little cam bearing thingy-mabobbers that go in the cam cap. We have the little piston ring compressor. And then over here we have a brand new OEM crank because the last one was sauced. On the ground, we got the cradle and the oil pan. The head is in this box. So we are ready to get to work. First thing on the to-do list on any engine build is to make sure everything is as clean as you can get it. You don't want to have metal shavings from the machine shop or dirt, grime, that kind of stuff going through your oil galleys or anywhere near your combustion chamber or in the engine at all. So we're gonna take some brake clean and rag and some compressed air and just clean up the block as much as we can. And then we'll do the same thing with the crank, the pistons, the rods. Yes, everything is brand new, but the rods, for example, come in an oil to prevent them from rusting in the box. So we need to get everything cleaned up before we even start thinking about assembling anything. Gotta love spending almost $1,000 on a crank to open it up brand new. You got rust and corrosion on it. That's pretty sweet. Shout out Mitsubishi. Okay, so we've got everything cleaned up. I just went ahead and pulled the old keys and this little ring off the old crank. So now we can get our main bearings in our block and in our main caps. And then we're gonna torque the main caps down on the block without getting the crank in there yet. Then we can take our T-gauges and start taking measurements. So we'll take those measurements that we get with the T-gauges. We're gonna measure it out with a little C-clamp micrometer type deal. We're gonna write those down. Then we're gonna measure the mains on the crank and we're gonna write those numbers down. Essentially what we want is the difference between those two numbers needs to be at the main bearing clearance that we're going for. And I believe I'm gonna go anywhere between 2 and 2.2 thou, if I'm saying that right. Between 0.002 and 0.0022 is the gap we wanna be for main bearings. So we put some ARP grease on these bolts before we ran them down, just so we can get proper torque specs. So there is a sequence in which we tighten these. I'll have it displayed on the screen. But we're going to first do all the bigger bolts to 27 foot-pounds, and then all of the smaller bolts are gonna go to 80 inch-pounds, and that is the first sequence. Then we're gonna hit it again and go to its full torque specs. Now we're gonna go back to the same sequence, but we're gonna torque the bigger bolts to 70 foot-pounds and the smaller bolts to 32 foot-pounds. And then those will be completely torqued down. So what we're gonna do here is go ahead and measure out this bearing surface here on the crank. Just go ahead and mic it out. Make sure you're getting a pretty accurate reading here. This is important. So now we're just gonna go ahead and zero that out. Now we can take our T-gauge, slide it into this number 1 hole here. Now we take our T-gauge and go ahead and drop it into our micrometer. Make sure it's a nice fit in there. And there you have it. So like I had mentioned, for mains we're going anywhere between 0.002 and 0.0022. On rods, it's gonna be a little bit tighter, so I'm happy with that. Now we can go ahead and move on to the last 4 on the main, and then we can move on to our rod bearings.
I'm on my own, broken alone. I feel the rain crashing down all around this empty town. I'm searching for the lost and found, but you don't care, you're unaware.
Just went through, finished up all of the mains. Here are our final numbers. So everything is in the spec we were looking for. So I'm happy with those. Yeah, so now we are ready to move on to rod bearings. I happen to have the rods right here. We are running the same rods that I run in the Subaru. These are the H-Tough rods by Manley. And yeah, we're gonna be running these in the Evo as well. They've treated us extremely well in the Subaru, and I'm super happy with them, so went ahead, ordered them up again. Let's get all of these unboxed, cleaned up, and then we can start doing the same bearing measurements as we just did with the main. All the rods are opened up and cleaned out. We're gonna go ahead and get our rod bearings in. I'm just using standard size ACL rod bearings for these, and we'll test fitment. I also have some extra oil clearance bearings here, just in case we need a little bit more room, but from what I've heard, standard size bearings all around normally work out just fine. So let's go ahead, let's get these bearings slapped in, and then we gotta torque these bolts down to 90 foot-pounds is what these ARP 2000s are rated for, which is a lot, but we'll get them in the vise and we'll be able to torque these down, no big deal. So just to evenly torque these out, I am doing a 30-60-90 pattern, and that way I'm not torquing one side down all the way and then, you know, God forbid this side's not seated and it has issues. Just being safe. All rods are torqued to 90 foot-pounds and we are ready to measure these out. So same process as doing the mains. We're just going to measure the surface here where the rod will sit, and we're just gonna measure it out with our little C-clamp, and then T-gauge the inside of the rod. Difference of the two is our clearance. And going over the instructions, it does say on here 0.002 minimum to 0.003 maximum. That is a little bit looser than what I ran on the Subarus. So I think with this, we're just gonna run exactly what we ran on mains, do the same thing on rods, and we should be good there. So same idea here, we're just gonna take the micrometer, get it on here, get us a measurement. Now there are oil galleys in the crank, so make sure you're not measuring on an oil galley. Go ahead, zero out the mic. Just like that, we are good to go. So I actually already did the other three. So we are pretty much good to get the crank installed. And then a little different than the Subarus, we're actually gonna connect the rods to the pistons first, and then we will drop it all down all in one unit, now that we don't have different case halves and stuff like that. Actually, before we get the crank in, let's go ahead and set our piston ring end gap. So this is actually very simple, but very important. We're just gonna take our piston. I have each bag of rings labeled 1 through 4, so we can keep these organized. Let's go ahead and open this up, and I'll explain what we gotta do. So in these bags, you have 5 rings. You have top and bottom oil ring, you have your oil expander ring, and then you have 2 compression rings. So one is shinier than the other. The shiny one is the top one. And what I found is that the top one has no marking or beveled edge to determine what side it has to sit. So I believe it can go in any way. This one has a dot. I'm not sure if you're able to see it, but there's a dot right about here. And that just marks that this side sits up when it's in the block. So what we need to do is take these rings and file them down to proper size. Now you might be wondering what the proper size is. And that's why we have this guy here. So depending on how much boost or what application you're running, if you're running nitrous or we're just gonna be somewhere around this medium high boost area. So when you come over here and multiply that out, so bore, it's 86.5, but converted to inches, it's like 3 point something times that 0.008 or the 0.007. Get that number, and that's what you are going to file these rings down to. I took a number pretty much in between this high boost and medium boost. 0.008 comes out to like 0.027 is the gap. And then the medium boost is like 0.023. So the gap I'm using is, it's hard to see on there, but it's 0.026. So just short of that high boost level, because my next one up is 0.08, and that is higher than all of it. So just to be safe, we're gonna keep it at 0.026, and we should be 100% fine. So we'll start out with our top ring. We're just gonna put it in the bore here. This is your number 1 cylinder. So we're gonna use our number 1 piston. So now we're just gonna take the piston and kind of push the ring down about an inch below the surface here. Keep it nice and level. Then you can go ahead and pick it up. And this gap right here is where we have to file down to 0.027. So that's why it's important to keep it nice and level. So right here, I can already tell that it's too small. So let's get this thing on the file and get it down to 0.027.
Yeah.
This ring's good to go. Now we gotta do the same thing on our second compression ring. And then these little oil rings just have to be a minimum of 0.015. Typically they are 100% perfect out of the box, but stick them in, measure them out, and make sure you're good. So once all your rings are good to go, we can go ahead and install them on the piston. So we're gonna start with the first oil ring. Now, this is your wrist pin center line, and these pistons are labeled, this side being the front. So this is gonna be the timing chain side. So your first oil ring is gonna go on the complete bottom groove in the piston, just like that. And the gap is gonna be right about here. Now you're gonna take your oil ring expander, and you're gonna wanna aim the gap towards the front of the piston. And it's gonna sit right on top of that bottom oil ring. Now we can take our top oil ring, and the gap's gonna go right about here. It's gonna sit right on top of that expander ring. Just like that. Now we can take our bottom compression ring, which is the one that's not shiny on these manly pistons, and we're gonna take dot side, and it's gonna go up, and the gap is gonna be direct bottom of the piston. Just go ahead, just like that. So our gap is direct bottom of the piston, and our top compression ring is gonna be the complete opposite. So this one, our gap is gonna be the top of the piston, and it sits in there. Listen. Just like that. It's gonna be the top. This is your bottom. And then our bottom oil ring should be right about there. top oil ring should be right about here, and our expander should be towards the front. And that's it. Manly does provide a nice diagram as well, so you can see exactly what I did. Top compression ring gap is towards the top. Second compression ring gap is towards the bottom. And then bottom oil ring, bottom left. Top oil ring, bottom right. And then the expander has a range. It can be somewhere in this area. And now all the time-consuming measurements to this engine build are done, and we can begin assembly. So let's get this flipped back over and we can drop the crank in. So first thing we got to do actually is install these oil squirters. So you can see those little holes down there. Those go to an oil galley, and somewhere in this bag we have 4 oil squirters that essentially will just bolt down into these areas, and it can provide oil to the cylinder. So these guys, I do have to look up the torque spec, but these will just bolt in right in that area. And there's a little dowel on it, so you know it's straight. All right, if you're using a rotted motor like I am, make sure you clean these things out thoroughly. There was actually a lot of metal buildup inside the little line, so I just took some brake clean and air compressor and a rag and a little needle to try to clean this thing out the best I could, and I'm confident it's a whole lot better than it was. Also, I just looked up torque specs on these guys, and they should go to 24 foot-pounds plus or minus a foot-pound. Now that all 4 oil squirters are cleaned and back in the block, we can move on to assembly lube. So our main bearings here are all gonna see a little bit of assembly lube with some of this red line stuff. And then same thing on the crank, all these main surfaces are gonna get some assembly lube. And that's just gonna help when we first start the car, so it has some lubrication there and it doesn't eat the bearings away immediately. Almost forgot, but these little thrust washers are going to sit right in here on the side of the block, like that. But let's get some assembly lube on there and it'll hold it right to the side here. And all that does is keep the crank from moving side to side and walking around on us.
That somebody gon' come around and give me just what I need. I don't wanna see you frowning, see you looking down and out. Coming to me crying, saying you miss having me around. Gave you chances and you blew it. You so easily influenced. All the times you told me beat it, now you gotta face the music. I'm saying
I know that I gotta stay away from all your games. Yeah, I know that I found somebody else to love me one day. And you'll realize the grass ain't greener on the other side. No, you did me dirty for the last time, so now I gotta say goodbye. So now I gotta say goodbye.
Now that all of our main caps are all torqued down and the crank spins nice and freely, really nicely actually, that's super satisfying. We're now going to get some assembly lube on these rod bearing surfaces, and then we can flip the block over and start installing rods and pistons. Okay, so now we can connect our connecting rods to our pistons. So essentially how this is gonna go, this is the front of the motor. This is the rear of the motor. There is an arrow on the piston showing that this is the front of the motor. The bearing tang on the rod, we want to face towards the back of the block when it sits in the car, so it's going to be against the firewall. So with that said, if this is the front of the engine, the timing case side, so it's going to be sitting like this in the car, we're going to want the bearing tang towards the rear. So it's going to sit just like that. So now we can get our wrist pin in. We got to get these clips in. These things are kind of a pain in the butt. Just work with them. You'll get them. I definitely like the snap ring clips a lot better, but this is what we got to work with. So what I'm going to do is just get one of these installed, What I found works easiest is kind of use the piston, the lip on the piston, as your friend. So get the bottom of the ring in first and use this part to kind of help compress the ring. Sit it down in there, kind of like that. I'm not sure how much you can see, but you want to kind of hold it down with your fingers and then take a little screwdriver and just pry the rest of the way in. Just be careful not to score up the edge of the piston too much. I know sometimes it's inevitable, but do your best. Take your time. There you go. And now that circlip is seated in there. Now what I'm gonna do is just take a little bit of assembly lube and just kind of lube it up inside the piston where the wrist pin's gonna slide in. Don't have to go too crazy, just get a little bit in there so it's pretty easy to slide in. Same thing with your rod, just kind of get some right in here. And then we can take our wrist pin out of the packaging and do the same thing here. Just get a little bit of assembly lube on there. It's gonna make it really, really easy to slide in. So, take your rod, take your piston, and remember, if this is the front of the engine, you want the tang to go that way. Now take the wrist pin, you can just slide it on through there. That's it. Now is the real difficult one. So, trick I learned for this one, take a socket about the size of the wrist pin, just kind of tap it down a little ways, kind of open up the gap as much as possible for this to sit. And same deal, you're just gonna slide it in there and use the piston as your friend. There we go. And then same deal, just take the socket. Now she's seated. Now we're just gonna take a little assembly lube and get your rod bearing nice and lubed up. Just like that. Now coming over the block, I like to get some ATF, a little trans fluid down in here. Assembly lube's a little thick, so I just get some ATF in here and it just helps out before it builds up any oil pressure. Same thing with the piston ring compressor, just get a little bit of ATF in here and it'll help the piston slide through. Now what I like to do is one last check, make sure our piston rings are in the right place. So we got top one, bottom one, and then our oil rings. Everything here looks good. So now take the piston ring compressor, put the whole rod and piston right through it. Now front of the engine is this side, because this is our crank, this is where our timing chain is gonna be. So make sure you're putting your piston in the right way. We're just gonna set it in. Now make sure that your piston ring compressor is flush on the head surface. And all we're gonna do is tap it in. Now that we have all the pistons in the engine block, we can turn it over and then get all of our rod caps on. So I am just gonna turn the engine over a little bit, help us out here. Now I can reach underneath, just pick up the rod a little bit, you can kind of see it moving back there. Pick it up and tap it from the top side. Now we can take our number one rod cap, make sure you are lining up the tangs. So tang here to tang there. I'm just gonna line these up. And then you can thread them in. Make sure the rod cap seats on the dowels on the rod itself. And then we can tighten that up. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and torque the rods in the same sequence we did in the vise. So 30, 60, 90. And then once those are torqued, our entire rotating assembly is complete. Let's go, guys. So we finally got the rotating assembly all assembled in the engine block with our rods, pistons, crank, everything torqued down and good to go. Tomorrow, I have to clean up this cradle because as you can see, it's she's a little crusty. So we're gonna get this thing cleaned up and then we can get this on. I'd like to get the head on and complete this long block. So I'm gonna pick this video up tomorrow. It's getting pretty late and I haven't eaten anything all day and I don't want to mess anything up. So I'm gonna put the camera down and clean up the tools and I'll see you guys in the morning. Good morning, guys. I just got done cleaning out this cradle, kind of did this off camera, took some time and got all the old grease and oil, everything off this thing. So what we gotta do now, we're just gonna clean this gasket surface with some brake clean. Same thing on here, just clean it up. And then we can slap the cradle onto the block. And I'm gonna be using some of this ultra gray. I know some people don't have very good luck with this. I've always had good luck with it. I use it on the Subarus and never really had a leak with it. So we're gonna be using that. And then I found these 6 bolts, which I believe are the bolts to hold the cradle on. If you guys recall, I'm not the one that tore this car apart. It was torn apart when I got it, and I've never built one of these. So I'm hoping these are them. This one is longer than the others, and it makes sense because one hole is deeper, and they all seem to fit perfect, and they thread in fine. So we're gonna use them. So we've gone ahead, we got the cradle installed. I just finger tightened the bolts. The ultra gray, the instructions say to let it cure for an hour before torquing them down. So we're gonna do that. If we have a look down here, you can see the RTV just starting to ooze out the sides. That's how we know it's like pretty much a perfect amount in there. So I'm happy with that. Let's let this cure. In the meantime, I need to head to a hardware store or something around here. Hopefully something's open on Sunday because I need to pick up some bolts, bell housing bolts, that are long enough to go through the engine stand. The bolts for these are not long enough, so we gotta figure something out for that. Not too worried about it though. I'm sure Lowe's is open and hopefully they have something we can make work. So we've gone ahead and let this sit for a little while. We're gonna torque these down to 19 foot-pounds. There is a sequence, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So let's go ahead and get this torqued down and then we can get this in the stand. We're now moved on to the engine stand, so we have better control over the engine. So this little hole here is gonna take this little filter, little torpedo looking thing. So we're gonna clean this out with brake clean, and essentially this is just gonna sit down in that hole. Other than that, we can start prepping for head gasket and head installation. So I'm just gonna clean the entire surface with brake clean, of course, and then these little tabs on the timing chain side, these have to get just a tad bit of RTV to prevent from leaks, just on the tabs, and the rest is just head gasket alone without RTV. So we're gonna do it on the top and the bottom of the head gasket just to make sure we don't have any leaks in the future. And then coming over to the table, I already have the head disassembled and pretty much ready to be installed. So make sure you keep your cam caps in order. They are labeled E1 through E4 and I1 through I4 for exhaust and intake. But make sure you keep them the same direction and you don't want to put them in backwards or not in order. And then this is the big cam cap, kind of sits right here on your timing chain side. And one of these holes, this one here, actually has a bearing that goes in there. So make sure you guys have new bearings. And I believe Mitsubishi sells 3 different sizes. There's 1, 2, and 3. This one, the old bearings were size 2, so I just ordered more 2s. I'm not sure if that 2 right there means that it takes a size 2 bearing, but it may. These bolts here, these were in a bag from the machine shop, so they must have took them out. I'm assuming these plugs are for the block somewhere. These 4, I believe, are for this cam cap. and these little ones we're gonna have to figure out. Now that our head stud holes are clean, we can come over here and start grabbing our head studs. So we're gonna be running ARP 2000 head studs, and essentially we're just gonna drop these down in. There's a little trick with head studs. If you back thread them a little bit, you'll feel them drop in, and then you can thread them in. Right there, and then they're gonna thread right in. So we're gonna get all these in. They're just gonna go hand tight. We don't actually torque them into the block, just hand tight, and then once we get the head on, then we'll torque the nuts down. But these, you don't want any sort of torque on these bad boys. Head is now installed on the block. We can start getting our washers on top of the studs and then get our nuts on. We're just gonna go hand tight on the nuts for now, and then we will start doing our torque sequence. So as I go to take my little socket to tighten my nut up, I quickly realized that the socket is too big to fit in the head. So we gotta fix that. So the torque sequence is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We're gonna go 30 foot-pounds, 60 foot-pounds, and then 90 foot-pounds all in that sequence, and then we'll have a fully torqued down cylinder head. We can now go ahead and torque down all of our cam caps. These all go to 106 inch-pounds, and there is a torque sequence. I'll have it on the screen. Also, this cap is done separately, and it's done 1, 2, 3, 4 is the sequence, and it's 22 foot-pounds, but we're gonna do that after we torque down all the little cam caps. So right about here, I already know something isn't right with this bolt. It wasn't tightening right. I didn't feel like it was gaining any torque. And we were only about halfway to the torque spec at this point. So you can see I kind of take the torque wrench off a few times to inspect it and see what's going on. But kind of knew we were too far gone. So these last few turns, I was just hoping that we would get to the torque spec. But in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't going to happen. So just have a few last looks and sent it the rest of the way, just trying it out. But yeah. That was the correct torque spec, but I think this bolt has just had enough, and it completely left the chat. As I was torquing up this number 2 bolt, it did feel a little weird, so I was going nice and slow, and if I'm being honest, halfway through, I knew it was going to happen. I could feel it stretching. I was just hoping it would hit the torque value that we needed, but it didn't. I have 4 new ones on the way already, but unfortunately, I guess this engine is going to have to be considered finished for now. Kind of a bummer, because we're really close to having a complete long block, literally a valve cover and an oil pan away. But it is what it is. Like I said, we got new ones on the way. This video is probably long enough as is, so I'm not complaining. Super cool. We almost have the 4B11T completely assembled and ready to drop into the Evo 10. And yeah, I'm stoked. Now I will say there's a big change of plans for this car. I was just gonna get this engine done, dropped in, and get the car running. But turns out we're going a little bigger and better than expected. This car is gonna be perfect, and I'm stoked. You guys should be stoked. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll catch you in the next one, but until then, peace out. See y'all later.